Today is John Calvin. Wow. It's going to be hard to leave here and get to church, but we will. I was looking at my bookshelf this morning, and I have read more biographies on John Calvin than any other single person, and have more books from him or about him than any single person. So we'll try to distill my appreciation for Calvin. You'll hear in many places he certainly had many imperfections, some of which he was well aware. But being here at a church with Presbyterian in the title, we are people who I hope in general are fond of John Calvin. I've told the story before, I'm sure, from the pulpit that, I grew up in Reformed Church in America, but you don't pick up on all these things as kids. And I came home from school one day in middle school, went to a public school, so we weren't having a great lesson on Calvin. There was just a paragraph about John Calvin in whatever textbook we were using on Western history. And of course, in a single paragraph in a big book, what's it going to say about John Calvin? He taught predestination, that God chooses who would be saved and who would be damned or something. And even though I'm sure I should have known better, it strikes you as, I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. So I came home and I was ready to tell my mom about this slightly concerning thing, and I mentioned John Calvin, and before I could get to the concern, she said, "Oh, John Calvin, we like him." Mothers, fathers, you never know what little sentence lodges into your children's brains. So I just paused there. I didn't continue with my sentence of ignorance about John Calvin, and had it impressed upon me, I should give this John Calvin guy another chance, and glad that I did. I have lots of books about him. I just brought a few. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, Bruce Gordon, I held up his book on Zwingli, and he has a very nice biography that came out in 2009, which was the 500th anniversary of Calvin's birth. And so this is about 350 pages. So this is a very good biography. An older one, I'm sure it doesn't look like this anymore, but smaller, quite a bit smaller, 150 pages or less, by T.H.L. Parker, John Calvin, a biography. You could look up that. You do have to be mindful sometimes the people that write biographies are coming at Calvin from a little different angle. They're influenced by Karl Barth, and so they have a little bit of a squint sometimes that's different than we might have. But this was a very good biography, one of the first I read. And if you want, this is not exactly a biography, and it's a big, thick academic book, but when you take out all the endnotes, it's about 300 pages, and it's really wonderfully done. It's called Calvin's Company of Pastors, Pastoral Care in the Reformed Church. It's by a friend of mine, Scott Manich. He's maybe, 10, 15 years older than me. He actually grew up at the church that I pastored long before I was there as a pastor in East Lansing, and was ordained in the RCA. He's also come into the PCA. He teaches at Trinity in Chicago, and he is really the world's expert on Calvin as a pastor. He's spent years and decades of his life in Geneva and other places, and bound France, reading French consistory register, basically presbytery and session minutes. And if that's what you like to do, then somebody should read what you've come up with. That's a really wonderful book. And this book, I'm so glad that Banner of Truth has a new edition, because my old edition was completely falling apart. Letters of John Calvin, and then there's a brief biographical sketch, some of which I've drawn from here, and I'll quote many times from these letters. This is not by all means all of his letters, but pulled out some of the most significant, I think 70 of his letters. I was holding up this book to somebody this week and saying, this is one of my favorite books, and I had forgotten that they had asked me to do a blurb, and it says right on the back, "This is one of my favorite books, Kevin DeYoung." Well, sure enough, it is one of my favorite books, and we have about 15 copies, I think, over in the book nook that I asked Caleb to order, so you can, wrestle your way to get it. But this is a really wonderful book. More than most figures in church history, John Calvin has elicited strong and opposite reactions. Here's one of Calvin's admirers. This historian says, Calvin taught the whole counsel of God, and even concerning predestination, none can truthfully say that what Calvin wrote and preached in any way departed from Scripture. What Scripture taught, Calvin believed, and what Calvin believed, he proclaimed to all who would listen to him, and from his own day to ours, men of discernment, you want to be of discernment, have regarded him as perhaps the greatest of all Christian teachers since the time of the apostles. So that would be on the admiring side, the greatest teacher since the apostles. Here's another view. This is from a contemporary Roman Catholic poet. I'll just give you part of his poem called Visiting Geneva. Calvin, padlock of the Sabbath, your followers protect you. Predestination wasn't yours, they claim, nor were the elect you. But when you were God, sermons went on all day. Without Newman or presence, children were denied play. I loved your moral snobbery, but the spirits you relied on turned atheist long ago. Come to Italy, Monsieur John. That is, come back to the Catholic Church. Earlier in the poem, the author has this little clever line. John Calvin, unforgiver, in your Taliban hat, you pervade bare St. Peter's in La France Protestante. Now, it's no surprise that I am more toward the perspective of the first quote than the second quote. But to claim John Calvin as a hero or as a formative influence, as he certainly would be for everyone in the Presbyterian tradition, does not mean we cannot be honest about his faults. He undoubtedly had a brilliant intellect. He was a godly man, a good pastor, a humble student of Scripture. He was a brilliant organizer, and he could also be impatient, critical, prone to anger, and he was a man of his own age with many of those blind spots. Jean Calvin, so his name French would have been Jean, was born in the city of Noyon in the Picardy region of France on July 10, 1509. His father, Gerard, was a secretary to the local bishop, a member of the rising middle class. His mother died when he was 4 or 5 years old, so he wouldn't have barely remembered his mother. His father remarried. His early childhood was not something that Calvin ever talked about or, as far as we can tell, considered formative for him. It would have been relatively unremarkable. He was one of many children. They would have gone to Mass. They would have been physically disciplined. They would have made pilgrimages and saw relics and celebrated feasts and lived like late medieval Christians. At age 12, Calvin received a benefice, that is a minor office in the church, kind of like a scholarship that allowed him to head off to university. Remember, we don't have to be overly impressed when we read that these people went to university at 13 or 14 years old. That was the normal time at which many students went off to university. He went to the University of Paris, where he was studying to enter the priesthood. In Paris, students and teachers could see that he was undoubtedly brilliant. He had a superior intellect. He had a great mind and memory, and he also could be rather exacting. And the system of discipline sometimes relied on students to report on other students' infractions, which Calvin didn't make him very popular. He was sometimes called the accusative case, which is a grammatical term, but they used it as a pun to describe Calvin. He loved books, and there is no record that he was prone to extravagance or to wildness. So he's off at university, and his father fell afoul of the local bishop, and so the local bishop is mad at Gerard, and so he cuts off Calvin's scholarship or benefice, and his finances dry up, and he has to leave off studying for the priesthood and pursue law instead. And so his father has him, around 1528, he begins to study law at Orléans and then at Bourges. An interesting comparison here, if you remember Luther, Luther's father wanted him to study law, and in defiance of his father, he went and studied theology. Calvin was studying theology, and in obedience to his father, he went and studied law because he didn't have the money for it. And Calvin's legal training certainly served him well. Interesting, compared to almost all these other people, that Calvin did not have the same kind of formal theological training. We would have said, to use today's terminology, that he never went to seminary, he went to law school. He was trained as a lawyer, and we can see that attention to detail, that precision in his studies and in his writing. Sometime in that period of his early 20s, we don't know exactly when, Calvin experienced a conversion. There's very little about Calvin that he writes about himself. That's why I love these letters, because you get to see his personality come through. You get to see something of the way he relates to people. He didn't write about himself very often. One of the very few places it is in his preface to the commentary to the Psalms. And Calvin loved the Psalms. It might have been his favorite book. He loved the personal nature of the Psalms, and so he reflects on his own life, and that's where we get just a few shreds of autobiography. And it's in that preface to the Psalms that Calvin says, I was at one time, quote, obstinately devoted to the superstitions of popery, but then God's mercy came upon him, and he says, quote, by a sudden conversion, subdued and brought my mind to a teachable frame. So Calvin says he had a sudden conversion. One of the first of these reformers to speak in that kind of language. They all had moments, and Luther had his tower experience, but Calvin says he was suddenly converted. Now, he doesn't mean he didn't know anything about Jesus. Of course, he was raised in the church. But a conversion, he must mean to the Reformation faith. And so, what do when you're a young man in your 20s and you have a sudden conversion? You start reading and studying and learning whatever you can. And as he's reading and studying, he discovers, to his surprise, that though he's but a novice, as he considers himself, everyone keeps coming up to him. John, would you explain this to us? John, we'd like you to lecture today. John, could you teach this to us? It is one of the ways in which God reveals our gifts to us often, is to see what do people come to us for help. Is it to learn? Could you teach? Could you instruct? Could you serve? And it doesn't have to be just a teaching gift, but that's often how the Lord reveals what we're good at. And so for Calvin, he was surprised. Everyone was saying, you tell us how to understand this. In 1532, he published his first book, which none of you have read. I have not read it, but it is a real page-turner, a commentary on Seneca, the ancient philosopher. Seneca had a book called On Clemency, and Calvin writes his first book. Now, it tells us something about Calvin, that his first book is about this Roman philosopher, because it tells us how Calvin, as we've seen with many of these others, was a trained humanist, not a secular humanist, but trained by this new school of thought to look back at the ancients, at the Greeks and the Romans, and go back to the sources. And so his very first book was a commentary on Seneca's De Clementia. Calvin was particularly influenced by this circle of humanists that revolved around, now you may expect me to say Erasmus, because he's been the humanist so far that everyone has keyed off of. He was important in Luther's story, important in Zwingli's story, important in Cranmer's story. Well, it's not Erasmus, but a French humanist, Jacques Lefebvre de Teples, or Jacques Lefebvre de Teples is how I would say it. But I think it's something like that. He was the leading French humanist of the day. There was gathered around him this word. What's that word, Fukushans? Mo. M-O, just Mo, okay? So it was this Mo circle of scholars and people who were studying, and from that grew up these Reformation emphases. Fast forward to the year 1533. There's a friend of Calvin's. So Calvin, just to keep in mind, was born 1509. So you do the math. He's in his 20s, 1533. Back in Paris, there's a man named Nicholas Cop, C-O-P, who is a friend of Calvin's. And Nicholas Cop gives a very pro-Lutheran address. And many people think, knowing who Nicholas Cop is, it's not a real nice thing to say about him, but they think, wow, that was a little too good for him. I think there's a ghostwriter behind this address, and we know he's friends with this guy that people are starting to talk about named Jean Calvin. And so there's speculation that the real author of this pro-Lutheran address was John Calvin. And in fact, scholars today think that if Calvin didn't write it, he at least had a significant hand in writing it. So, because this is an uproar in Paris and Calvin is implicated, he goes and he flees for fear of his life. And he hides out in various places here and there. You got to remember this point in Western European history, like we've seen, you have the continent is dividing between Catholic and Protestant. And so there's regions and cities, and it would be usually whole cities or cantons or regions or lands would go one way or another. So when you're fearful for your life, you try to find these safe havens that have already declared themselves and been established for the Reformation. Calvin hides out here and there until things get worse. A year later, in 1534, something called the Placards Affair, or the Affair of the Placards. A placard meaning a sign. So some people who are for the Reformation, burgeoning Protestants, in the middle of the night, October 1534, in the dead of night when people are sleeping, they post all of these placards around Paris. And the placards are sort of crudely done, but they're very pro-Reformation, and they are against the Mass and against the Eucharist, and they even are so bold as to place one outside the bedchamber of the king. They call the Mass an abomination. They wake up, and the state and Paris is none too happy with these placards, and their response is swift and severe, and so they begin persecuting the Protestants, which continues until the next summer. Some of Calvin's friends are executed. He goes into exile himself in the Swiss town of Basel. So Basel, Swiss town, German-speaking. And there, in Basel, he works on a French translation of the Bible. He completes what will grow to become his most famous work, and that is the Institutes of the Christian Religion, the first edition of which is written, I know most of you can't see that anyways, is written in 1536. He was all of 27 years old. The first edition of the Institutes had only 6 chapters, one on law, the creed, the Lord's Prayer, the sacraments, false sacraments, and Christian freedom. Just 6 chapters, just meant to be an explainer volume on the faith. Very familiar pattern. You're going to talk about the Apostles' Creed, you're going to talk about the 10 Commandments, you're going to talk about the sacraments. It was a surprise success. In 9 months, it sold out. People detected in Calvin an ability to think and an ability to write, and his name becomes well known. After a trip to France, Calvin decided to settle in the city of Strasbourg. Strasbourg today is it's in the Alsace region, so it has changed hands between the French and the Germans many times. Today it's right on the border inside France. Then it was a German city, and Calvin went to settle in Strasbourg because Strasbourg was a Reformation city. And so he wanted to go to Strasbourg, but there were some military exercises, some armies moving here and there, and the road was closed. and you don't have a lot of alternate routes when you have to make your way through the countryside and the mountains. And so Calvin needed to find another way. Now, quite out of his way, if you know some geography, Paris, Strasbourg, and then down here in Geneva, you got to kind of go around a long ways. And so Calvin stops in Geneva. Remember, Geneva is not at this point one of the cantons of the Swiss lands. Remember, Zurich was German-speaking, Basel was German-speaking, Strasbourg was German-speaking, Geneva is French-speaking. Calvin stops in Geneva, and Geneva had only recently decided for the Reformation. And the decision was really more political than spiritual. It's important to get our minds here that just like during the Cold War, nations, big nations, little nations, sort of everyone's dividing up. Am I pro-communist or anti-communist? And this is the same thing. I'm pro-Rome or anti-Rome. I'm for the Pope or against the Pope. I'm for Luther or against Luther. So it wasn't necessarily that the leaders of the town had a profound spiritual experience, but they can kind of look and see what's happening in the Swiss cantons, what's happening around them, and oftentimes, in order to form military or economic alliances, they decide, we are for the Reformation. But they need a lot of work. It's hardly a reformed city. So enter into the picture here now the most important human being in the story of Calvin's life. Wow. And that is this man named William Farel, or Guillaume Farel. That green is not any better. So Farel is in Geneva trying to do the work there. He is a generation older than Calvin, and he sees great promise in Calvin's future. He hears that the man who wrote the Institutes is there. So this is around 1536, so Calvin's still not 30 years old. They hear the man who wrote the Institutes, this bestseller, this great work, is in town, and Farel detains him and says, you need to stay in Geneva. I know you want to go to Strasbourg. And so Calvin writes about this in his preface to the Psalms. Calvin admitted he was by nature unpolished and bashful. Calvin was probably someone in person you walk away and you think, smart guy, little awkward. He said he preferred, quote, shade and retirement. Many of us do. Strasbourg is where, we'll come back to him. Wow, this is bad too. Martin Butzer is. He wants to go to Strasbourg. I'm going to write. I'm going to do French things. I'm going to have this impact through my scholarship, shade and retirement, and Farel says no. Here's how Calvin writes about it. Famous paragraph. I had resolved to continue in the same privacy and obscurity until at length William Farel detained me at Geneva, not so much by counsel and exhortation as by dreadful imprecation, which I felt to be as if God had from heaven laid his mighty hand upon me to arrest me. After learning that my heart was set upon devoting myself to private studies, for which I wish to keep myself free from other pursuits. He wants to be a research professor. He wants to be a private scholar. Finding that he gained nothing by his entreaties, Farel proceeded to utter a curse, that God would curse my retirement and the tranquillities of my studies if I should withdraw and refuse to give assistance when the necessity was so urgent. This is Farel. He's a fiery guy. He says, don't mean this in a funny way, he says, may God damn your studies and your retirement and your tranquility while you head off to Strasbourg and read your books. We need you here in Geneva, right in the lion's den. And so Calvin, as he would again and again, he submits himself to Farel, and he takes up the work in Geneva From 15, these markers last one word. You know, people, R.C. Sproul had a chalkboard, and the technology has not improved. From 1536 to 1538, he throws himself into the work, and his work was not appreciated. He was French, and to oppose him became an act of patriotism. They spoke French. They didn't like the French. He had no official political power. In fact, there's a debate on, was Calvin ever ordained? I haven't had to look it up because with all these other people, you have a date when they were ordained. There's no known date when Calvin was ordained. Some people say he never was. Others say he was ordained by the Catholic Church, but not the Protestant, or vice versa. For my part, I find it hard to believe that when he came into Geneva to preach and to pastor, that the council there wouldn't have ordained him if he hadn't been already. And the Catholics, with all sorts, they throw everything at Calvin against him. And this doesn't come out that he hadn't been duly ordained. So though we don't have record, I assume that he was. They do not like the changes. It is a rocky 2 years. The people disliked him intensely. Mobs rioted outside his house. They threatened to throw him into the river. They named their dogs Calvin, not in a cute way. Looking back on those 2 years, Calvin said this: I can truly testify that not a day passed in which I did not long for death 10 times over. Not what you put on your CV. He says about Geneva, quote, there is no place, this is later, there is no place under heaven that I am more afraid of. I would submit to death 100 times rather than to that cross which I had to die daily 1,000 deaths. They don't like him, and he is not happy. In 1538, he gets kicked out of Geneva. It's the happiest any man has ever been to be fired from his job. And you know where he goes? Strasbourg. That's where he wanted to go all along. And by all accounts, as he spends, now, let's try this one. He spends 3 years in Strasbourg, and they were the happiest years of his life. It's a border town between France and Germany, and there he works with a sort of father figure to him, Martin Butzer. He pastors a church. He develops a close relationship with Butzer. He works on a French liturgy, French psalms, French hymns. He writes commentaries. He completes another edition of the Institutes. He's very busy. He's doing the things he wanted to do. We should insert here, he also got married. Writing to Farel with his advice, he says at one point, so he's writing back to Farel. Farel was also kicked out of Geneva, and he went up to Neuchâtel, another Swiss town and canton where he will minister the rest of his life. So Farel doesn't go back to Geneva. So he's writing from Strasbourg over to Farel, and all of his friends are looking for a wife. They are trying to set him up. And he says, always keep in mind what I seek to find in her, for I'm not one of those insane lovers who embrace even the vices of those they are in love with when they are smitten at first with a fine figure. The only beauty which allures me is this, that she be chaste, not too nice or fastidious, economical, patient, and likely to take care of my health. Not exactly the Song of Songs, but he knew what he needed, and they didn't always have the same kind of romantic expectations. He married a woman. Whoops, I always forget, even though there's one L, I think, and two T's. It's my daughter Mary's middle name, and Trish and I always forget how to even spell it. One L, two T's. Idelette de Boer. There's a book, I think it was by John Gerstner's wife, called Idelette, which is kind of a historical fiction. It's based on truth, but it's expansive and kind of imaginative on Idelette, Calvin's wife. She was the widow of a man who had been an Anabaptist and then became Reformed. She came into the marriage with 2 children, which Calvin agreed he would raise as his own. With Idelette, Calvin had 1 child, a premature baby who died in infancy. Calvin wrote to a friend, "The Lord has certainly inflicted a severe and bitter wound in the death of our baby son, but he is himself a father and knows best what is good for his children." As we'll see, Calvin, as much as any of these men, though he would not be a martyr, he lived with tremendous suffering. He was married to Idolette for only 9 years, and she died. He wrote to his friend Peter Verret, V-I-R-E-T, Verret, in April 1549, "Truly, mine is no common source of grief. I have been bereaved of the best companion of my life, of one who, had it been so ordained, would have willingly shared not only my poverty, but even my death. During her lifetime, she was the faithful helper of my ministry. From her, I never experienced the slightest hindrance. She was never troublesome to me throughout the whole course of her illness, but was more anxious about her children than about herself." Sounds like a lot of moms. He told Farel, "I do what I can to keep myself from being overwhelmed with grief. My friends also leave nothing undone that they may administer relief to my mental suffering." So though his romantic sensibilities were not off the charts, he truly loved Idolette, and by all accounts they had a good marriage, and when she died, he says, "That was my best friend." He never remarried. Calvin was relieved to be out of Geneva, so go back to his time during Strasbourg, but he cared about the people there. During this time, he wrote a long letter, it's more like a little book, to a Catholic cardinal named Sadoleto, Cardinal Sadoleto. And it's quite a fine work that really, in maybe 50 pages, gives you a distillation of Calvin's apology for the Reformation and against the Roman Catholic Church, because Geneva was not very firmly cemented in the Reformation. And so this Cardinal Sadoleto is writing to Geneva to say, "Come back to Rome. Here's why you ought to be good Catholics." And even though they kicked Calvin out, who do they turn to? Who can help us? And so they get Calvin to write a reply to Sadoleto and an apologetic for the Reformed faith. Few could match Calvin's intellect, his giftedness, and his work as a stylist. It's one of the things, it's hard for us to tell. Most of us wouldn't read Latin or read Old French. We get an English translation, but you can tell even in the English translation, he was an exceptionally good writer. He had learned the craft to write well and communicate well. So as Geneva struggles to maintain the Reformation, lo and behold, momentum starts to build. I think we need to bring Calvin back. So they're lobbying, his friends are, you need to go back to Geneva. Calvin writes in 1540 to his friend Peter Verret, I just mentioned, Calvin said, "I read that passage of your letter, certainly not without a smile, where you show so much concern for my health and recommend Geneva on that ground. Why could you not have said at the cross? For it would have been far preferable to perish once for all than to be tormented again in that place of torture." So tell us what you really think, John. He says, oh, you're concerned for my health. I'd rather go to the cross would be better for my health than to go back to Geneva. Farel had settled, as I said, up in Neuchâtel, and it's interesting that they didn't call Farel back. He was older. And one of the things, this is instructive for us, sometimes the first generation in a fight, Farel was gifted and he was fiery, but he never really moved past the polemics stage, the fiery anti-papist stage, where Calvin, next generation, understood we need to do more than just scorched earth and tell everybody how bad the papists are. We're going to need to write things down, and we're going to need to establish institutions, and we're going to need to train pastors. And he had more of a vision for what needed to be done, not just what was wrong with Catholicism. Calvin certainly would have preferred to stay in Strasbourg. But once again, in communication with Farel, he submits. He writes, "Had I the choice at my own disposal, nothing would be less agreeable to me than to follow your advice." Now here's a key line. that will come to define John Calvin. But when I remember that I am not my own, you can hear a generation later, that very language is going to come to be very famous in the Heidelberg Catechism, that I am not my own. It's one of Calvin's sayings. But when I remember that I am not my own, I offer up my heart, presented as a sacrifice to the Lord. In the 1540s, you can see on Calvin's letters, he starts, the seal on the letters it's very simple, crudely done, but the seal is a picture of a hand cupped like this holding a heart. It became Calvin's unofficial emblem. And later, we don't know if this came from Calvin directly. The first time we see it is a couple years after his death. This picture, of a heart and some hands, probably looks like Allstate now, has these three words: prompte et sincere, promptly and sincerely. And then years later, the motto would be filled out, cor meum tibi offero Domine, prompte et sincere. My heart I offer to you, O Lord, promptly and sincerely. And whether the motto itself was written down by Calvin, it certainly was Calvin's theology, and we see it in this letter to Farel. I don't want to go to Geneva, but my heart is not my own, and I lift it up to the Lord, and so he returns. He left, just such drama here, he left Geneva the Sunday of Easter, 1538. He returns to the pulpit in 1541, and with no additional comment, doesn't say anything about, before we get started, let me make an announcement, it's good to be back, or I told you so, nothing. You know what he does? Turn in your Bibles to the very next text that he had left off of 3 years ago, as if to say, it's forgiven, it's forgotten, and this is what my ministry is about. It's about teaching you the Word. Kicked me out, I left, I'm back, we'll pick things right back up. What can we say about Calvin's life in Geneva? He was not a dictator. His power was largely unofficial. It was influence, it was intellect, it was his preaching, his writing, his mind, his organization, and his sheer endurance. He reformed the liturgy, he reformed worship, he reformed music and hymns. His preaching was significant. From 1549 onwards, he preached twice on Sunday, every weekday on alternate weeks, in the neighborhood of 10 sermons every 2 weeks. He preached normally directly from his Hebrew Old Testament, from his Greek New Testament, usually without much preparation because he's doing a million things and he's good enough to teach directly from the Hebrew, from the Greek, and give people the sense and preach his sermons without notes, usually for over an hour. The output was staggering. 89 sermons on Acts, 123 sermons on Genesis, 107 on 1 Samuel, 174 sermons on Ezekiel, which is probably in the neighborhood of 170 plus more sermons than we've heard on Ezekiel, 159 sermons on Job, 200 sermons on Deuteronomy, and the prize goes to, drumroll, Isaiah, 342 sermons. Keep in mind, Bruce Gordon's biography points this out. Now, I've been to St. Peter's a few times. One trip, Barry was there with me. Beautiful, magnificent church building. And you just imagine, and you can see the pulpit where Calvin would have preached. And you can just imagine people would have been in there, this soaring church, and just captivated and mesmerized by one of the greatest minds and preachers of all time, and eager to sit down in reverence to hear the Word of God, except it wasn't like that at all. Gordon points out preaching services were something more akin to a tavern. There was barking dogs, crying babies, there's no nursery, there was conversation, there was constant movement, there were even fist fights sometimes in the back. it turns out when you make everyone go to church, some of the people really don't want to be there. Calvin once remarked about his congregation, and trust me, I would never think to say this about Christ's covenant. He said, they enjoy breakfast more than the testimony of their salvation. He reformed discipline. He introduced church discipline. That was probably his most unpopular move. He believed in protecting the Lord's table. One of the most dramatic scenes of Calvin's life, when these opponents, say more about that if we don't run out of time, there was a rival party called the Libertines. See, unlike Wittenberg and even Zurich, which became thoroughly in Zwingli's control, and he didn't have a lot of opposition in Zurich, except for some Anabaptists popping up, Calvin there was constantly rival political ecclesiastical parties butting heads with Calvin, and among them were the Libertines, troublers of Israel, he called them. And one time they came in wanting to partake of the sacrament, and Calvin, in a dramatic scene, flung his arms across the elements and said, these hands you may crush, these arms you may lop off, my life you may take, my blood is yours, you may shed it, but you shall never force me to give holy things to the profane and dishonor the table of my God. You can see why he was a hero to some and hated by others. Calvin's concern for discipline was pastoral. He had not a session, but it was called a consistory, same idea. It's made up of 12 elders and pastors from the city, and then they also had the city magistrates were on it. The town was governed by a council called the 200, and then a council of 60, and then like an executive committee called appropriately the Little Council, where the power was. After a lot of back and forth, it was decided the consistory could handle church discipline. Usually, 5 to 7% of the adult population was brought before the consistory for some disciplinary measure each year. In the first 2 years, where Calvin really had control in Geneva, there's about 13,000 people in Geneva, and around 150 persons are brought before the consistory. That's a pretty high percentage of people. Now, most of the time, these people are not being excommunicated. A lot of times, it's what we might call counseling. And they bring them in, and there's an admonition, and we heard this, and they admit it, and then they admonish them or they censure them. Less frequently, there would be suspension, and even less frequently, excommunication. And Scott Manich and many others have read through these, and they provide a fascinating list. And you can see all of the occurrences. What are the most common things people are being brought in for discipline? Well, here's some examples. Wild living, Sabbath violations, blaspheming, gambling, dancing, failure to come to church, papist superstitions, going to Mass, family conflicts, often spousal abuse, business disputes. Here's one, insulting the French, the validity or marital conflicts, complaining about Calvin was a common one, adultery was right at the top of the list, and often they had to determine the validity of marriages. This was happening, I mentioned this before, these clandestine marriages, people make vows to each other, then they can have sex, and then sometime later they get officially married in the church, and the consistory was constantly sifting through, okay, are these people really married? What happened here? Calvin argued, somewhat enlightened for his day, that the marriage contract should be entered into willingly by both parties, both the man and the woman should agree to it, and that children were not bound by their parents' prearranged marriages. Calvin was brought in not just to reform the church, but the whole society. He drew up a document called the Ecclesiastical Ordinances. He was a master organizer and administrator. And here's one of the secrets of Calvin's success. He simply outworked everybody else. Bruce Gordon says, here was a formula that would serve Calvin well throughout the time in Geneva. Extremely hard work on his part, combined with the disorganization and failings of his opponents. You want to make headway? Keep at it. Work harder, be more organized than your opponents. It's true. We hear this as kind of a pep talk, never give up, but it really was a secret to Calvin's success. He faced constant onslaughts and he pressed on. Many people hated Calvin because they or their family members had been disciplined by the consistory. It's only 13,000 people. Everybody knows probably somebody in their circle of friends or family. My cousin, my aunt, my sister, my wife, brought before Calvin's consistory. They do not like this guy. And Calvin was, should be admitted, easily perturbed. The libertines knew how to get under his skin. Calvin said, "It is very difficult for me not to boil over when someone gets impassioned, yet so far no one has heard me shouting. But I lack the chief thing of all, and that is being trained by these scourges of the Lord in true humility. And therefore, it is all the more necessary that I should be tamed by the free rebukes of my brethren." It's worth noting here, one of Calvin's ironic strengths that's not there at first, but especially in the last 10, 15 years of his life. And here's a lesson for us. He had weaknesses, he had imperfections, all of us do, but he was aware of them. He knew that he was prone to lose his temper. He knew that he was prone to be impatient. None of us are going to be fully sanctified this side of heaven, but self-awareness sometimes is next to godliness. And at least he understood what his weaknesses were. Even Calvin's critics today have to admit Calvin did much good in the city. He established a vibrant diaconate for the aid of the poor, a public hospital. The deacons were busy doing anything and everything, purchasing clothing and firewood, providing medical care, attending to births, guarding sick children. Calvin started schools. He was a champion of education. He, despite all the opposition, was a success. John Knox, when he was exiled in Geneva, famously said it was the most perfect school of Christ since the time of the apostles. Now, I mentioned that Calvin was, by his own admission, shy and awkward. You probably would have called him an introvert's introvert. And yet he established many deep friendships. You see this in his letters. He wrote one letter, so far as we know, to Martin Luther, a year before Luther died, 1545. So what's that? Calvin is mid-30s, Luther's about to die. It's a very deferential letter. He calls Luther the very excellent pastor, my much respected father, my most renowned sir, most distinguished minister, my ever-honored father. Calvin was passing it on to Melanchthon, his friend and Luther's friend, and he wanted Luther to read a couple of tracts. And you can read it, Calvin's like, "I know you're so busy," and you could maybe even have one of your students read it and give you the summary of it. Calvin, in the background, is pretty frustrated with Luther, that he thinks Luther is an absolute hothead and he is causing division among the Reformed efforts when there should be unity, and he wants Luther, especially with the sacraments and worship, to read some of the things he's written. One, Calvin thinks he's more right than Luther, and two, just let's try to bring this together. Luther never read the letter. Melanchthon wrote, much to Calvin's frustration. Melanchthon writes back and basically says, that wouldn't have gone well. Luther's very suspicious. He doesn't take that kind of criticism well. It would have made things worse, and so I never even sent him the letter. Calvin is very frustrated. He writes back to Melanchthon, "Your Pericles," that's what he's calling Luther, "your Pericles allows himself to be carried beyond all due bounds with his love of thunder. We all of us acknowledge that we are much indebted to him." And Calvin goes on and he says, "I am perfectly fine that he should have the chief place among us." He was willing to say, yes, Luther's the man. We're all in debt to him. We even can all submit ourselves to Luther. But then he says, "You will say his disposition is vehement and his impetuosity ungovernable." But he tells Melanchthon, "You're making it worse by just," we would say, "you're an enabler. You're just tiptoeing around Luther and you won't even give him my letter, and his thunder has gotten out of control." Calvin wrote letters to all sorts of people: King Edward VI, the Duke of Somerset, the King of Poland, the King of Navarre. He wrote to Cranmer and Knox and Bullinger and Melanchthon, and he wrote many times to Farel. One major criticism of Calvin, I want to try here to get to the end of his life. The one most significant criticism has to do with this man named Michael Servetus. Michael Servetus was a Spaniard. He was a doctor of some renown, and he fancied himself an armchair theologian. He was also a heretic. He wrote heretical books on the Trinity. I mean, everyone thought he was a heretic. The Catholics wanted to kill him. He was notorious. In the mid-1530s, he agrees to meet with Calvin. Calvin was going to meet with him. When you meet with a heretic, you're risking your life. Calvin was going to risk his life because he said, I want to win him to the Lord. Servetus stood him up. Several years later, he takes up a correspondence with Calvin. He asks a series of theological questions. Calvin tries to interact with him. Calvin responds at one point by sending him a copy of his Institutes. Servetus responds by sending back the Institutes with all of his corrections in the margin. Servetus was not welcome anywhere, certainly not in Geneva. He was condemned by the Catholic Church. In most places, he was a wanted man throughout Europe. In 1553, he escaped the Inquisition, and quite out of his way, some people think he may have been certifiably mad, he shows up in Geneva, right there at St. Peter's Church. Calvin's preaching. What are you doing? Calvin has him arrested. Some of the libertines object. A few others object because they're confused. Wait, the Catholics don't like him. Isn't he on our side? No, we both don't like him. Almost all of Switzerland concurs with Calvin. Servetus is a heretic. He needs to be punished. Calvin wants him to recant. That's what he wants. He's not eager for him to be killed, but in the end, he is sentenced to death. Calvin argued for beheading, thinking that it would be more humane. And I suppose I would much rather be beheaded than burnt at the stake. But the council disagreed and said, no, we're not going to behead him. He is going to be burnt at the stake. And so the singular incident for anyone who wants to point to Calvin and make him out to be a dictator is the burning of Servetus in Geneva. And from our vantage point, we would certainly say the punishment was a mistake. I think it's been a step in a good direction that we don't burn heretics anymore. But few would have thought that it was a mistake in the day. In fact, all of Europe, we've seen that's how each side dealt with the other. Calvin wrote more in his lifetime than most people will ever read. And what set him apart was not only his writing ability, but his work as an exegete. If you go back and you read commentaries from 500, 1,000 years ago, they're always interesting and they're illuminating, but sometimes they're a bit fanciful, they're not all that helpful. You still can go back to Calvin and be very helped by his commentaries. He writes economically. He is a great exegete. His power was in explaining the Bible to people. And another strength you wouldn't guess, he could be flexible, not on the truth, but sometimes on the words. Luther tended to be absolute, and this is the way we must say it. Calvin, on the other hand, would allow and had more of a sense as a second-generation reformer. He wanted to keep this thing together. And if he could find some way to phrase it that made various Protestants agree, he looked for that. He wrote small tracts, he wrote pamphlets, he wrote liturgies, he wrote catechisms. Here's from his Geneva Catechism. You're going to appreciate this, and it will sound familiar. Here's Calvin's Geneva Catechism. I forget the exact date, if it's 1550s. It begins, "What is the chief end of human life? To know God by whom we were created. What reason have you for saying so? Because he created us and placed us in the world to be glorified in us. And indeed, our life, of which himself is the beginning, should be devoted to his glory. What is the highest good of man? The very same thing." So you have right there what will find its way into the shorter catechism, the chief end of man, glorify God and enjoy him forever. His most famous book is the Institutes of the Christian Religion, 1536, and then the final edition, 1559. It's gone from 6 chapters I'd say it's gone through a few editions. Now it's 80 chapters. It's 2 big volumes today. It's about 1,500 pages. It's one of the books that I can absolutely say changed my life. When I started reading it, my dad had a copy of it. My dad's name is Lee DeYoung. My name is Kevin Lee DeYoung, so I took it, it said Lee DeYoung, and I just put Kevin in front of it, and it became my books, and I still have them. And I saw 1,500 pages, and I thought I can read this 5 pages a day. It'll take me a year, I'll miss some days. Lots of it I didn't understand, and I did it. And then I did it another year, just, okay, maybe I'll get more of it. And that changed my life as much as any book after the Bible. Calvin's death. There's much more I wish you could say about his theology. There's some great quotes I'll skip over. Need to hear how he dies. He was sickly throughout his life. By age 30, he was suffering from asthma, migraines, indigestion. He didn't eat well, he didn't sleep well, he didn't exercise. He didn't have really, even after his wife died, other people would have done most of the work of taking care of the children. He didn't have children or grandchildren to distract him. He didn't go on holidays at the sea. He literally worked himself to death. Not an example for us. There's a necessary balance between he outworked everyone, good, he worked himself to death, bad. Bruce Gordon says, Calvin's punishing routine and recurring illnesses aged him and put him in an early grave. I don't know. I mean, does this look like a guy in his 50s? I don't know how accurate that is, but he died before he reached 60 years old. He knew he had been used by God, but he came to the end of his life with exquisite pain, and he wrote about it. He suffered from arthritis, nephritis, kidney stones. He writes very dramatically about passing kidney stones in some of his letters. Hemorrhoids, also writes about those. Ulcers, pain in the legs, he was coughing up phlegm and blood, and he says, God managed to keep all of my faculties intact so I could feel all of this until the very end. He was keenly aware of his faults, and he knew that he was almost dead. He said at the last weeks of his life to the political leaders in Geneva, he says, it is true, he does not deny, so this is someone reading a statement from Calvin. Calvin does not deny that God has made use of him as an instrument for the little he has done. And if he had said otherwise, he should be a hypocrite. So Calvin says, okay, I admit, I think the Lord's used me. He begs then again to be excused for having done so little in proportion to what he was bound to do. And he feels persuaded that the messieurs have borne with his natural disposition, too vehement by far, and with which he is offended, and with his other vices, as God also has been. On April 28, 1564, Calvin made a final appearance before the ministers in Geneva. And he says to them, I know I've been sick a lot of times, but this time I'm really sick and I'm not getting better. He says, quote, it will cost me a great effort to die. He recounted how he came to Geneva, and he said there was nothing in place. You had preaching, and you had nothing else. Everything was a disorder. He said, I've lived among constant bickering, fighting, and opposition, and in Calvin's mind, there were a lot of good people in Geneva, but he still saw it as a place that on the whole was filled with ungodliness. Calvin worried that once he was gone, the thing he was fragilely holding together with the force of his intellect and personality would fall apart. Now, thankfully, as we've seen, here's another lesson in history. You can't always choose your successors, but pray that they choose a good one. So with Zurich, Bullinger actually, in some ways, most ways was more successful. They choose as the successor Theodore Beza, who will carry on the Reformation work admirably in Geneva. So he says to these ministers, I have had many infirmities which you have been obliged to bear with, and all I have done has been worth nothing. But I can say this, that I have willed what is good, that my vices have always displeased me, that the root of the fear of God has been in my heart, and I pray that the evil I've done would be forgiven me, and if there was any good, that you conform yourselves to it and make it an example. As to my doctrine, I have taught faithfully, and God has given me grace to write what I have written faithfully as I was in my power. I have not falsified a single passage of the Scriptures, nor given a wrong interpretation to the best of my knowledge. And though I might have introduced subtle senses, I never studied subtlety. I cast that temptation under my feet, and I always aimed at simplicity. I have written nothing out of hatred to anyone, but have always propounded what I esteem to be for the glory of God. And in one final statement to the ministers, thinking of everything he has set in place, and this is something about Calvin's disposition and character, he says, I pray you make no change, no innovation. People often ask for novelties. People are going to ask for the next new fancy thing. Don't do it. On May 27, 1564, just shy of his 55th birthday, only 54 years old, he passed away. He was, according to his wishes, buried in a common cemetery in an unmarked grave so that no one would be tempted to worship him in his death. As soon as he died, there was a race to define his legacy, and in some ways, his opponents got the upper hand. Catholics were eager to set him out as a tyrant, a dictator. He burned Servetus. They slandered him as sexually immoral. They said he died of venereal disease. They wanted to discredit him. His friends, Beza in particular, came to present a different view of Calvin. And in the end, those two views have been prevalent for 500 years. Though undoubtedly, through his writing and his theology, his labors have to be deemed a success, not least of which that we are all here. There is one surviving hymn attributed to Calvin. Can't be certain, but it's attributed to him. You probably know this hymn. Here's the first verse. And it does say something about Calvin's heart. I greet thee who my sure Redeemer art, my only trust and Savior of my heart. Who pain didst undergo for my poor sake, I pray thee from our hearts all cares to take. And then verse 5, our hope is in no other save in thee. Our faith is built upon thy promise free. O grant us such stronger hope and sure that we can boldly conquer and endure. Calvin understood himself to be a man of many weaknesses, and he devoted himself really to one thing, to teaching the word and reforming the church and Geneva according to that word. And so let me give the last word here to Calvin, and you'll hear his utter dependence upon Christ. He says, we see that our whole salvation and all of its parts are comprehended in Christ. We should therefore take care not to derive the least portion of it from anywhere else. If we seek salvation, we are taught by the very name of Jesus that it is of him. And then here you can get something of Calvin's gift as a writer. If we seek any gifts of the Spirit, they will be found in his anointing. If we seek strength, it lies in his dominion. If purity, in his conception. If gentleness, it appears in his birth. If we see redemption, it lies in his passion. If acquittal is what we want, we find it in his condemnation. If remission of the curse, in his cross. If satisfaction, in his sacrifice. If purification, then in his blood. If reconciliation, then in his descent into hell. If mortification of the flesh, in his tomb. Newness of life, in his resurrection. Immortality, in the same. If inheritance of the heavenly kingdom, in his entrance into heaven. If protection, then from his security. If supply of blessing, then in his kingdom. If expectation of judgment untroubled, then in the power given him to judge. In short, since rich store of every kind of good abounds in him, let us drink our fill from the fountain, and we need no other. Amen. See you over there, and next week, Lord willing, John Knox.